Dominoes. Level 2. Sherlock Holmes, The Norwood Mystery by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Text adaptation by Jeremy Page. Read by Nigel Bourne, Dave John, Hugh Kermode, Paul Panting, Nigel Pilkington, Jill Schilling and Rufus Wright.
Chapter 1. A Wild, Excited Young Man.
Life in London is not what it was,
said Sherlock Holmes to Dr. Watson. They were sitting at the breakfast table in their Baker Street rooms one morning in the summer of 1894. Holmes was smoking a cigarette, and Watson was reading the newspaper.
"True, Holmes,"
said the doctor.
"For most people, life is much better now."
but for me, Watson, life is not so interesting,
explained Holmes.
I loved to read the newspaper, hoping to find some news of an interesting crime for me to investigate, or a dangerous criminal for me to catch. Where are all those clever criminals these days?
He smiled sadly.
"Sometimes I don't understand you, Holmes,"
said Watson.
"I like living a quiet life myself."
Holmes did not reply, but opened his newspaper in a lazy way and started to read. Suddenly, they heard a loud knock at the street door downstairs. They heard the knock again and again. Mrs. Hudson, the housekeeper, ran to open the door, and a wild, excited young man fell into the hall. He pushed the poor housekeeper out of his way and ran up the stairs.
"Who are you, sir?"
asked Watson.
"And what do you want?"
The young man looked at Watson, then at Holmes, and started to explain.
"I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes. I'm sorry,"
he said.
"Please don't be angry. I feel so afraid, Mr. Holmes."
Holmes asked the young man to come into the room, and told him to sit down.
Have a cigarette,
he said,
and tell us who you are and why you have come here.
The man took a cigarette from the box on the table, and Watson lit it for him. After some minutes, he stopped shaking and spoke.
"My name is John McFarlane,"
he began. Neither Holmes nor Watson knew the name.
And?
asked Holmes.
"And,"
replied McFarlane, starting to shake again,
"I am in terrible trouble. You must help me, Mr. Holmes. The police want to arrest me and send me to prison, and I have done nothing, Mr. Holmes, nothing."
Interesting,
said Holmes.
Very interesting. Don't you agree, Watson?
Watson saw that his friend was excited by this mystery, and wanted to know more.
Mr. McFarlane,
Holmes went on,
why do the police want to arrest you? What have you done?
"Nothing. I told you I've done nothing. But they think that I murdered a man called Jonas Oldacre, a builder who lived in South London at Norwood."
Holmes lit another cigarette.
I'm very sorry to hear this, Mr. MacFarlane. Please, tell us your story.
MacFarlane saw Watson's newspaper on the breakfast table and opened it.
It's here,
He said.
in today's newspaper. The story of the murder of Jonas Oldacre. I'll read it to you. Terrible crime at Norwood. Murder of well-known builder. The police are sure that I am the man who killed him. They followed me here from the station and are waiting to arrest me. This news will kill my poor old mother, Mr. Holmes. It will kill her.
MacFarlane was still shaking and smoking his cigarette. Watson looked at him in an interested way. MacFarlane was a good-looking young man, with bright blue eyes and long hair, but he looked very afraid. He was about 27 years old, and Watson could see that he came from a good family.
If the police are following you,
Said Holmes,
we must work quickly. Mr. MacFarlane, please have another cigarette. Watson, could you take the newspaper and read us the story?
Watson opened the newspaper and started to read. Sherlock Holmes listened carefully, his eyes closed, as Watson read the story from the morning newspaper.
Murder of well-known builder. Late last night, or early this morning, a terrible crime took place at Norwood in South London. Mr. Jonas Oldacre has lived at Norwood and has worked there as a builder for many years. He is 52 years old, unmarried, and he lives in Deepdean House on the Sydenham Road. The people of Norwood know Mr. Oldacre as an unusual man. He does not often leave his house, but his business has made him very rich. There is a small timber yard behind his house, and last night, at about midnight, a man who was out walking saw that some of the wood there was on fire. He immediately called the fire brigade, who arrived soon after. The wood was very dry and burned quickly, so it was impossible to put out the fire. The fire brigade were surprised when Mr. Oldacre did not come out of the house, and 2 of their officers went inside to look for him. But Mr. Oldacre was not in the house. In the bedroom, the 2 men found an open safe, which was empty. There were papers on the floor, and bloodstains on the walls. The men also found a blood-stained walking stick in the room. This stick belongs to Mr. John MacFarlane, who visited Mr. Oldacre at his home yesterday evening. The police are sure that they know the motive for the crime and are looking for Mr. MacFarlane. They will arrest him when they find him. At Norwood, police now say that Mr. Oldacre's bedroom windows on the ground floor of the house were open. They have found some burnt remains, possibly of a body, in the fire in the timber yard. The police think that there has been a murder. They say that the criminal killed the builder in his bedroom, then pulled his dead body into the garden and burned it in the timber yard. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard is the policeman who is investigating this most terrible crime.
This is very interesting.
he said at last.
Can I ask, Mr. McFarlane, why the police have not already arrested you? I understand from the newspaper that they are sure you murdered Mr. Oldacre.
I live at Torrington Lodge, Blackheath, with my mother and father, Mr. Holmes. But last night, after my business with Mr. Oldacre, I stayed in a hotel at Norwood and went to work from there this morning. I knew nothing about this crime until I was on the train, when I read the story in the newspaper. I understood immediately that I was in terrible trouble. So when my train arrived at the station, I ran to Baker Street to see you, Mr. Holmes, and to tell you that I am not a criminal. I did not murder Mr. Jonas Oldacre. The police, I'm sure, were waiting for me at work and also at my father's house at Blackheath. A man followed me here from the station and...
Suddenly, there was another knock at the street door. Then they heard men on the stairs, and Inspector Lestrade entered the room with 2 other policemen.
Are you Mr. John McFarlane?
He asked. The young man stood up, his face white.
I am,
he said. Lestrade gave him a long look.
John McFarlane, I am arresting you for the murder of Mr. Jonas Oldacre, the builder of Norwood, South London.
Chapter 2. McFarlane's Story. McFarlane put his head in his hands and sat down.
Mr. Holmes, help me, please.
Holmes turned to Lestrade.
Inspector,
He said.
Perhaps you can give us half an hour. I'm interested to hear Mr. McFarlane's story.
And I'm sure it will be a very good story,
replied Lestrade.
but it won't be true.
Please, Inspector,
said Watson. Lestrade thought for a long time.
All right,
He agreed at last.
you've often helped us, Mr. Holmes. But I must stay with Mr. McFarlane, and I will listen very carefully to everything that he says. You have half an hour,
He went on, looking at his watch.
Thank you, Inspector.
Said McFarlane.
You can thank Mr. Holmes.
Replied Lestrade, sitting down opposite the young man.
First,
McFarlane began his story.
I know nothing about Mr. Jonas Oldacre, only his name. My parents met him many years ago, and they were friends for a long time. But Mr. Oldacre moved to Norwood, I understand, and after that they never saw him. So I was very surprised when he walked into my office at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. I work in the City of London as a lawyer. When he told me why he wanted to see me, I was astonished.
Here he stopped and looked, first at Holmes, then at Lestrade.
Go on,
Said Lestrade at last.
He had some papers in his hand. These papers.
McFarlane took them out of his pocket and put them on the table.
This is my will, he said. I've written it myself, but you are a lawyer. Please copy it for me. I will wait. I agreed to do this. I started to copy the will, but was very surprised when I read that he wanted to leave everything to me. Mr. Oldacre was a strange little man with very white hair and grey eyes. When I looked at him, I saw that he found my surprise very funny. He laughed and told me that he was unmarried and had no children. He knew my mother and father when he was a young man and wanted to help me to make my way in the world because I was their son. I didn't know what to say, but I thanked him warmly and finished the will. Here it is.
Macfarlane showed Holmes a blue piece of paper.
Mr. Oldacre then asked me to go to his house at Norwood yesterday evening, because he had more papers there that I needed to see. I didn't want to go, but I had to. You must promise not to tell your mother or father about this, he said. It must be a wonderful surprise for them. I promised him that I would say nothing, but I didn't understand why it was so important to him. I took the train to Norwood and arrived there at about 9 o'clock. It was difficult to find Mr. Oldacre's house on the Sydenham Road, and it was 9:30 when I at last knocked on the door of Deep Dean House.
Stop,
said Holmes.
Who opened the door to you?
It was Mr. Oldacre's housekeeper.
Macfarlane replied.
A woman of about 55 years.
And she told Mr. Oldacre that you were there?
Holmes went on.
That's right.
Macfarlane agreed.
She then took me into the dining room, where Mr. Oldacre was waiting for me. We ate a light meal of sandwiches and fruit. Then Mr. Oldacre took me to his bedroom. There was a safe in the corner of the room, and Mr. Oldacre opened it and took out a lot of papers. We looked at them together and didn't finish until about 11:30. Mr. Oldacre said that we mustn't wake up the housekeeper, so I left the house by the French windows in the bedroom, which were open. I couldn't find my walking stick, but Mr. Oldacre said that he would give it back to me next time. I hope you will come back often, he said. When I left, Mr. Oldacre was in his bedroom and the safe was open. His papers were on the table. It was too late for me to go back to my father's house at Blackheath, so I went to a hotel called the Annerley Arms in Norwood and spent the night there. I knew nothing more about Mr. Oldacre until I read the story in the newspaper this morning. And everything that I've told you is true.
Lestrade looked at Holmes.
Any more questions?
Possibly,
said Holmes.
but first I must go to Blackheath.
You mean Norwood?
Said Lestrade.
Perhaps,
replied Holmes with a strange smile. The inspector didn't understand, but said nothing.
Mr. Macfarlane,
said one of the other policemen who was waiting at the door.
come with us, please.
Macfarlane stood up, and the two policemen took him down the stairs and out into Baker Street. Lestrade stayed in the room with Holmes and Watson. Holmes looked at Macfarlane's papers, which were still on the table.
interesting.
He said.
Mr. Oldacre's writing is very easy to read in some places, but very difficult to read in others. And here it's impossible. Can you read this, Watson?
Watson agreed that it was impossible to read.
And why is that?
Asked Holmes.
I've no idea.
Watson replied.
Is this important, Mr. Holmes?
Asked Lestrade.
Possibly,
said Holmes.
Mr. Oldacre wrote his will on a train. We can read everything that he wrote when the train was at a station, but it's impossible to read what he wrote when the train was moving. Mr. Oldacre spent the journey writing his will, so his train was an express, which stopped only once between Norwood and London Bridge.
Very interesting, Mr. Holmes,
said Lestrade.
But I have a murderer to see. I must go. Goodbye, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson.
Goodbye, Inspector,
said Holmes with a smile. Chapter 3. A Visit to Blackheath.
Tell me, Holmes,
said Watson when they were alone again.
Why is it important that Mr. Oldacre wrote his will on the train?
Holmes lit a cigarette.
Because it means he wrote it yesterday on his journey to see Mr. Macfarlane. I think it's very strange that he worked on these important papers on the train. Perhaps they weren't so important for him.
What are you thinking, Holmes?
Asked Watson.
I'm not yet sure what has happened here, Watson,
Holmes replied.
But give me time. Give me time. Now I must leave you and go to Blackheath. I need, I think, to speak to Mr. Macfarlane's mother and father.
Holmes put on his coat.
While I am out, Watson, ask yourself this question. Is Mr. Macfarlane a stupid man? I think not. But does a clever man immediately kill someone who has just promised to leave him everything in his will?
Holmes gave Watson a long look.
Goodbye, Watson. Until later.
When Sherlock Holmes needed to think, he liked to walk. And this morning, he decided to walk all the way from Baker Street to London Bridge. His long legs moved quickly as he crossed the city. A lot of people stopped to look at the tall detective as he made his way to the station. But Holmes didn't see them. He was thinking about John Macfarlane and Jonas Oldacre, and asking himself if Macfarlane was a murderer. He really didn't think so, but he knew that it would be difficult to convince Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. To Lestrade, Macfarlane was the murderer of Jonas Oldacre. He had a good motive, and he spent the evening at the builder's house. Holmes arrived at London Bridge Station, and found that he had to wait 20 minutes for the next train to Blackheath. he bought the late morning newspaper and read, "Norwood murder. Man arrested." Holmes didn't read the story, but looked at the end. "Says Inspector Lestrade, I think we have our man." Holmes bought a ticket and got on the train. Soon he was leaving London and travelling south to Blackheath. It was a little before 11:30 when he knocked on the door of the Macfarlanes' house. It was a large house with a long, green garden at the front, and Holmes was a little surprised when Mrs. Macfarlane herself answered the door.
Mrs. Macfarlane? Good morning. My name is Sherlock Holmes, and I am trying to help your son in his time of trouble.
Oh, Mr. Holmes, please come in.
The woman replied. Holmes followed her into a small room at the back of the house, where a fire was burning brightly. They sat down.
John is not a murderer.
She began immediately.
I know my son, Mr. Holmes, and...
Holmes held up his hand.
Mrs. Macfarlane,
he said.
I can see that you're very worried, but there are some questions that I must ask you.
Anything.
She replied.
Please ask me anything.
What can you tell me about Mr. Jonas Oldacre?
At this question, Mrs. Macfarlane was suddenly very excited.
He is, or was, a very bad man,
she said.
A long time ago, he and I were friends. He wanted to marry me, but I found out that he was a cruel man, a dangerous man. I told him that I didn't want to see him again, and 6 months later, I married my husband, John's father. He wasn't rich like Oldacre, but he was a good man. He is a good man, Mr. Holmes, and a good father to John. We've always been a happy family. And now this.
What did Oldacre do when you sent him away?
Holmes went on.
He was angry, very angry. He sent me this in the post.
Mrs. Macfarlane got up and took a photograph from the desk in the corner of the room. It was a photograph of her as a young woman. There were black lines across her face where, many years before, Oldacre once slashed the photograph with a knife. But Holmes could see that she was a very beautiful woman.
It arrived the day that I married my husband.
Holmes took the photograph from her and looked at it thoughtfully.
A dangerous man,
he said.
Oh, yes,
Mrs. Macfarlane agreed.
a very dangerous man.
It is strange, then,
Holmes went on,
that in his will he left everything that he had to your son.
We don't want anything from that man, Mr. Holmes. If he's dead, then I'm happy. But I know that it wasn't John who killed him.
Holmes stood up.
Mrs. Macfarlane, thank you. Is Mr. Macfarlane not at home?
Mrs. Macfarlane shook her head.
He's taken the train to London to see if he can help John.
She explained.
Then I won't stay any longer,
said Holmes.
Try not to worry too much, my good woman. If your son is really innocent, I'm sure we can convince the police. Inspector Lestrade is sometimes a little slow, but he is a good detective.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes,
said Mrs. MacFarlane.
I'm sure that you will do everything that you can to help John.
Mrs. MacFarlane, you can be sure of that,
Holmes replied with a warm smile. Mrs. MacFarlane said good-bye to the great detective at her front door and watched him walk quickly away to the station. Chapter 4. A Visit to Norwood. Holmes arrived in Norwood early that afternoon. He had no problem finding Deep Dean House on the Sydenham Road. The builder's house was large and modern, and had a big garden with a lot of very old trees. Next to the house, Holmes saw the timber yard, where the police found the burnt remains after the fire. He walked into it and saw piles of wood everywhere, and also some bags of hay. On the ground he saw some burnt remains, and he crouched down to look at them. Were these the remains of Jonas Oldacre's body? It was impossible to say. Holmes stood up and went back into the garden. As he stood there, looking thoughtfully at the house, a policeman came out.
"Can I help you, sir?"
he asked.
I'm Sherlock Holmes,
said the detective.
Perhaps you've heard my name?
"Mr. Holmes! Of course I know your name, sir,"
replied the policeman in surprise. He was fat, perhaps 50 years old, with a round face and bright blue eyes.
"Sergeant Judd, Scotland Yard. I'm very pleased to meet you, sir."
And I'm pleased to meet you,
said Holmes.
I'm helping Inspector Lestrade with his investigation. Have you found anything here?
Judd looked very pleased. His blue eyes shone.
"Yes, sir, we have. You know about the burnt remains in the timber yard, I suppose?"
I do,
Holmes agreed.
I've seen them for myself.
"Well, we found some buttons in the ashes, and we think they're the buttons from Mr. Oldacre's trousers. It's murder, Mr. Holmes. We're sure of that."
Perhaps,
said Holmes.
But I prefer to decide for myself. Is it all right if I look round the house and garden, Sergeant?
"Please do, Mr. Holmes. But I think that you'll find that we're right. There's been a murder, and Inspector Lestrade has arrested the criminal. We can all sleep better in our beds now that MacFarlane is under arrest."
Judd went back into the house, while Holmes stayed outside in the garden. There were very few flowers, and the garden was very different from the MacFarlane's garden in Blackheath. Holmes crouched down to look at the lawn. It was a warm day, and the lawn was very dry. He looked carefully for more than an hour but found nothing interesting in the garden. Next, he decided to search the house. The front door was open, and a policeman was standing inside.
Good morning,
said Holmes, as he walked into the house. At the end of the hall, he found Oldacre's bedroom. There were no police in the room, and Holmes spent a long time looking at the walls. He saw the bloodstains, which were a deep red colour, and on the floor, footprints made by Oldacre and Macfarlane. But he found no one else's footprints. He looked at the papers from the safe, and he also found the builder's bank books. He spent a long time looking at these, and was interested to see that Oldacre wasn't as rich as everyone thought. To Holmes' surprise, he had very little money in the bank. He then tried to find the deeds to the house, but they were not with the other papers. Holmes asked himself why. When he was sure that there was nothing more to see in the bedroom, he crossed the hall to the kitchen, where he found Oldacre's housekeeper, Mrs. Lexington, at the table. She was a small, dark, silent woman with grey eyes and silver hair. She didn't look at the detective when he walked into the room and spoke to her.
Good morning. My name's Sherlock Holmes, and I'm helping Scotland Yard with their investigation,
he said.
Mrs.
Lexington,
she replied without looking up.
Mrs. Lexington, housekeeper to Mr. Jonas Oldacre.
I'm very pleased to meet you, Mrs. Lexington,
Holmes went on, and sat down opposite her at the table.
What can you tell me about yesterday evening?
The housekeeper gave Holmes a long look.
Nothing,
she replied.
There's nothing that I can tell you, Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
Really?
Said Holmes.
So you didn't answer the door to Mr. Macfarlane last night?
I did,
she shouted angrily.
The murderer.
Ah,
said Holmes.
So there is something that you can tell me.
Mrs. Lexington looked very cross.
I opened the front door of this house to Macfarlane at 9:30. I know now that I opened the door to a murderer.
And then?
Holmes asked.
Then nothing,
she said at last.
I was very tired, and I went to bed an hour later at 10:30. My bedroom is at the other end of the house. I fell asleep immediately. I heard nothing, and I saw nothing.
Did you sleep all night without waking up?
Asked Holmes.
The smell from the fire woke me up,
Mrs. Lexington answered.
I got out of bed and started to look for Mr. Oldacre. I looked in every room of the house, but I couldn't find him anywhere. He was dead, of course. I know that now. Macfarlane killed him and burnt his body in the timber yard. And Mr. Oldacre was such a good, kind man.
Please,
said Holmes.
Don't upset yourself. Tell me, did Mr. Oldacre have any enemies?
Everyone has enemies,
replied Mrs. Lexington.
but Mr. Oldacre lived a very quiet life here at Deepdean House. No one in Norwood wanted to kill him. That's how I know that MacFarlane is the murderer. That young man has evil eyes, Mr. Holmes. He has the eyes of a murderer.
Thank you, Mrs. Lexington,
said Holmes.
Is there anything more you can tell me? Anything that could help us with our investigation?
I can tell you this,
answered the housekeeper.
The police found some buttons in those remains in the timber yard this morning. Those buttons are Mr. Oldacre's. They're the buttons from his trousers. He was wearing them last night.
You've been very helpful,
said Holmes. He stood up.
But now I must go. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Lexington.
The housekeeper got up suddenly.
I tried to save him, Mr. Holmes. Poor Mr. Oldacre,
she said.
I ran out into the timber yard, but the wood was so dry. It was burning so quickly. I can't remember the last time it rained. The smell was terrible. When I think...
Thank you, Mrs. Lexington,
Holmes said once more.
Goodbye.
He closed the door behind him as he left the kitchen. In the hall, he met Sergeant Judd, who was coming down the stairs.
Mr. Holmes,
said the policeman.
I hope that your visit has been helpful.
Very helpful, Sergeant,
Holmes replied.
Thank you. And I hope that your investigation is going well?
We have our murderer, Mr. Holmes,
the policeman answered.
Inspector Lestrade is talking to him now at Scotland Yard. His name is John Hector MacFarlane, and he killed Mr. Oldacre for his house and his money.
I'm very pleased to hear that you have your man,
said Holmes, with his strange smile.
It's obvious, I'm sure, that Mr. MacFarlane murdered Jonas Oldacre and burnt his body in the timber yard.
I'm happy to hear that you agree, sir,
replied Judd.
Goodbye, Mr. Holmes.
Goodbye, Sergeant,
said Holmes. He walked slowly to the front door, looking carefully at the walls in the hall, and left the builder's house. Outside, he took a last look at the garden, house, and timber yard, and drew a plan in his notebook before walking through the streets of Norwood to the station. It was a fine summer day, but Holmes wasn't happy. In the train back to London, he asked himself a number of questions. Could John MacFarlane really be a murderer? Was Jonas Oldacre really dead? Why did the builder suddenly decide to leave all his money to a young man that he didn't know? And why did he write his will on an express train? For now, Holmes did not know the answer to his questions, but he was sure that they were good questions to ask. Chapter 5. Who is Mr. Cornelius? It was early evening when Holmes arrived back at 221B Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson opened the door to him, and he followed her upstairs. Watson was waiting for him in their rooms.
Holmes!
He cried.
At last! Where have you been? I was worried.
No need to worry, Watson,
Holmes replied.
I've been to Blackheath and also to Norwood.
You must tell me everything,
said Watson, who was very excited.
Later,
answered Holmes.
First, I must think some more.
But Holmes!
Watson shouted angrily. Holmes held up a hand.
I must think, Watson,
Holmes said again. He walked to the corner of the room and picked up his violin. Mrs. Hudson left the room, shaking her head. Watson angrily started to read a book, while Holmes began to play the violin. He played for more than an hour, his eyes closed. Watson knew that his friend was thinking deeply. He had to wait until Holmes was ready to tell him about his visits to Blackheath and Norwood. At last, Holmes put his violin on the table and sat down.
Watson,
he said,
it has been a strange day. I have spoken to Mr. MacFarlane's mother and Mr. Oldacre's housekeeper, a Mrs. Lexington, and still I don't know what really happened at Deepdean House last night. Perhaps our Mr. MacFarlane isn't innocent after all, but an evil murderer.
Do you really think that, Holmes?
asked Watson.
No, Watson, I don't,
Holmes answered.
I still think he's innocent. But, as Inspector Lestrade tells us, he had a good motive for killing Jonas Oldacre, and he was at Deepdean House yesterday evening.
What did you learn from his mother, Holmes?
Said Watson.
I learned something very interesting,
replied Holmes.
I learned that Oldacre once asked her to marry him.
Really?
Really,
said Holmes.
And he was very unhappy when she said no to him. He was so angry that he sent her a photograph of herself which was slashed with a knife across her face. Mrs. MacFarlane was a very beautiful young woman, Watson. It isn't difficult to understand why the builder was so hurt when she married another man, a man with no money. The photograph arrived on the day that she married John MacFarlane's father.
Oh dear,
said Watson.
So Oldacre was unlucky in love.
Yes,
Holmes agreed.
But it is strange that he wanted to leave everything that he had to Mrs. MacFarlane's son. Very strange.
Was Mrs. MacFarlane surprised?
Asked Watson.
I want nothing from Mr. Jonas Oldacre, she said.
Holmes replied.
And my son wants nothing from him. I am happy that he is dead. I understand how she feels, Watson. She's a good woman, I am sure. Too good for Mr. Jonas Oldacre.
Did she tell you more about him?
No, nothing more,
said Holmes.
Next, I travelled to Norwood. to Deepdene House to see for myself the place where the builder met his death. It's a big modern house with a large garden. There are a lot of trees.
So Oldacre was a very rich man,
Watson suggested.
He had a large house and a large garden.
Holmes replied.
But he wasn't so rich after all. I saw his bank book.
Here, Holmes opened the cigarette box on the table and took out a cigarette. He gave his friend a short time to think about his words before he lit it.
I see,
said Watson at last.
Do you?
Asked Holmes.
I'm not sure I see yet. But I must go on with my story. As I said, Oldacre's house was large and modern, and next to it was the famous timber yard.
He took out his notebook and opened it on the table in front of him.
Here, Watson. I drew a plan of it.
Watson got up and walked across the room to stand behind Holmes and look at the plan.
You see,
Holmes went on,
this is the Sydenham Road. Here is Deepdene House, and this is the timber yard. On the left are the French windows which open into the builder's bedroom. As you can see, it's possible to look into the bedroom from the road.
Is that important, Holmes?
asked Watson.
I don't know,
Holmes replied.
Possibly. Inspector Lestrade wasn't at Norwood this afternoon, but I met his sergeant, a man called Judd. He, of course, was quite sure that our Mr. MacFarlane is a murderer. The police found some buttons in the ashes in the timber yard, you see, and these buttons were buttons from Oldacre's trousers. And so, says Sergeant Judd, the builder is dead, and so MacFarlane is a murderer.
This doesn't look good, Holmes,
said Watson.
No,
Holmes agreed.
Our young friend is in deep trouble here, I'm afraid. But we must not give up hope, Watson. I searched the garden after talking to Sergeant Judd, but I found nothing. Then I went into the house. First, I searched the builder's bedroom. The bloodstains on the walls were fresh, and I saw Oldacre's footprints on the floor, together with John MacFarlane's. But there were no others. I looked at the papers from the safe, which were on the table, but I'm sure that some of the papers were not there. I couldn't find the deeds to the house anywhere.
Where do you think they are, Holmes?
asked Watson.
I don't know, but I'm sure that our young friend didn't take them. He had no reason to steal the deeds if Oldacre wanted to leave his house and money to him. Well, Watson, next I spoke to the builder's housekeeper, Mrs. Lexington, a small, quiet woman. She never looked at me once when she was talking to me. I am sure that she knows much more than she wanted to tell me. She agreed that she answered the front door to John MacFarlane at 9:30 yesterday evening. She went to bed at 10:30. Her bedroom is at the other end of the house, and fell asleep. She woke up later and smelled smoke from the fire. She got up and searched everywhere for Oldacre, but she couldn't find him. Of course, she thinks that this is because he was dead. Murdered.
What did she say about the builder?
asked Watson. Holmes held up his hand.
A good man, she told me. He had enemies, of course, as everyone has enemies, but his life at Norwood was a quiet one. Nobody wanted him dead. Only his murderer, our friend Macfarlane. He has evil eyes, she tells me, Watson.
Evil eyes?
Watson replied.
Was the woman mad?
Not mad, Watson,
said Holmes,
but also not very helpful. Mrs. Lexington told me very little. As I said, I am sure that she knows more.
Did you find out nothing at Norwood that could help Macfarlane?
asked Watson. Holmes looked thoughtful.
Possibly,
he said at last.
You remember I said that I saw Oldacre's bank book, and that it showed that he was not as rich as everybody thought?
Watson nodded.
Well,
Holmes went on,
when I looked at his cheque-book, I found that he wrote a lot of cheques to someone called Mr. Cornelius. These were cheques for a lot of money. Who is this Mr. Cornelius, Watson? And why did our builder pay him so much money? That is what I want to know.
This could help our young friend, and prove to Lestrade that he is not a murderer, that he is innocent,
cried Watson, excited by Holmes's news.
Perhaps, Watson,
Holmes agreed.
But for now we have nothing more while Lestrade has Macfarlane's visit to Oldacre, the buttons from the builder's trousers in the ashes in the timber yard, and Mrs. Lexington's story. I must say, Watson, I do not feel hopeful.
Holmes put out his cigarette and picked up his violin again. Watson ate dinner alone that night and went to bed early. Holmes did not go to bed at all. He spent the night playing the violin, smoking cigarette after cigarette, and thinking about John Macfarlane and Jonas Oldacre. In the end, as the sun came up the next morning, he fell asleep in his chair. Chapter 6. A Thumbprint on the Wall. Watson was surprised to find his friend fast asleep when he came down to breakfast the next morning. He shook him gently.
"Wake up,"
he said.
"Mrs. Hudson will be here soon."
Holmes woke up immediately.
Good morning, Watson,
he replied. He saw the questions in the doctor's eyes before he could ask them.
Yes, I have been here all night. Yes, I have slept very little. And no, I do not know how we can save our young friend John Macfarlane.
"Oh,"
said Watson.
"Then perhaps you should wash and change before breakfast."
You're right, Watson,
Holmes agreed. He left the room, and Watson sat down at the table. Soon after, Mrs. Hudson came in with the morning newspaper and a telegram.
Good morning, Dr. Watson,
she said.
Here's your newspaper, and this telegram has just arrived for Mr. Holmes. It looks very important.
Watson took the telegram and looked at it thoughtfully.
I'm sure it is very important,
he agreed.
Perhaps it's about Mr. McFarlane.
The young man who came here yesterday morning?
That's right,
said Watson.
Inspector Lestrade is convinced that he's a murderer, but Holmes and I don't agree.
A murderer?
The housekeeper replied.
Well, he was a strange young man, so wild and excited. But a murderer? I don't think so.
Mrs. Hudson, your opinion is good enough for me,
said Watson.
Now, is that my breakfast that I can smell?
The housekeeper smiled.
You're always ready for your breakfast, Dr. Watson,
she said.
It'll be about 10 minutes.
As Mrs. Hudson left the room, Holmes returned. He immediately saw the telegram in Watson's hand.
That looks interesting,
he said.
For me?
Watson nodded and gave him the telegram. Holmes opened it with a paper knife and read it silently. He said nothing, but looked out of the window onto Baker Street.
Well?
Asked Watson when he could wait no longer. Holmes turned to look at his friend.
It's from Lestrade. The inspector is at Deepdene House at the moment. He says he has proof that McFarlane is the murderer of Jonas Oldacre. In his opinion, we should now give up.
This doesn't look good, Holmes,
said Watson. To his surprise, Holmes laughed.
Inspector Lestrade has always been sure that John McFarlane killed the builder,
he said.
And now he says that he has proof. Well, let's see his proof. This is not the time to give up, Watson. We'll go to Norwood immediately.
But Holmes,
said Watson,
it's still very early, and...
Just then, Mrs. Hudson arrived with their breakfasts.
And you haven't had your breakfast,
Holmes went on with a smile.
All right, Watson. We'll go after breakfast. I'm sure that Inspector Lestrade's proof can wait.
Holmes ate nothing himself, so Watson enjoyed a very large meal, and it was after 9 o'clock when they left Baker Street. They took a cab to the station, and it was not long before they were at the front door of Deepdene House. Watson rang the doorbell.
Now, Watson,
said Holmes,
you will meet the silent Mrs. Lexington.
A moment later, the door opened, and the housekeeper stood in front of them.
Mr. Holmes,
she said.
How can I help you?
Good morning to you, Mrs. Lexington,
said Holmes.
This is my good friend, Dr. Watson. Is Inspector Lestrade here?
He is,
the housekeeper replied.
Please take us to him.
Holmes and Watson went in and followed Mrs. Lexington to the back of the house. Lestrade was sitting at a table. He looked very pleased to see them.
Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, good morning,
he said, standing up.
You've come to see my proof, I suppose?
That's right.
Holmes agreed with a smile.
I am very happy for you, Lestrade, that you were right all the time.
It's good of you to agree that you were wrong,
said the inspector.
As for me, I never thought that McFarlane was innocent. The man is a murderer.
I'm sure that you are right, Inspector.
Holmes agreed.
But perhaps we can see your proof now.
Of course,
said Lestrade.
Come with me.
He stood up, and Holmes and Watson followed him into the hall.
Here,
said the inspector.
Look at this.
Holmes and Watson crouched down to look at a bloodstain on the wall.
It's a thumbprint,
Lestrade explained.
John McFarlane's thumbprint.
Are you sure?
Asked Watson.
Oh, yes,
Lestrade replied.
That is John McFarlane's thumbprint. I'm sorry, Dr. Watson, but your young friend killed Jonas Oldacre. He will die for this crime.
Holmes looked very thoughtful.
You're very quiet, Mr. Holmes,
said the inspector.
Do you have nothing to say?
Holmes stood up.
As I said before, Inspector, it's obvious that you are right about McFarlane. He killed the builder for his money and his house. I have only 2 questions.
Go on,
said Lestrade, who was no longer smiling.
First,
said Holmes,
who found this thumbprint?
It was Mrs. Lexington, the housekeeper, who saw it first.
The inspector replied.
She showed it to Sergeant Judd.
Really?
Holmes looked very pleased with this answer.
What's your second question, Mr. Holmes?
Asked Lestrade.
Why didn't your men find the thumbprint yesterday?
That's easy to explain,
The inspector replied.
They weren't looking for thumbprints yesterday. Not in the hall. And the thumbprint is a little hard to see.
Yes, it's hard to see.
Holmes agreed.
Watson and I had to crouch down to see it. But Mrs. Lexington saw it. Perhaps she was washing the floor. I suppose that you are sure that the thumbprint was here yesterday, Inspector?
Of course it was.
Lestrade replied crossly.
Do you think that McFarlane left Scotland Yard during the night and came here to make a thumbprint in blood on the wall?
Perhaps not,
said Holmes thoughtfully.
Then I must ask you both to excuse me. I must return to Scotland Yard to talk to the murderer.
Lestrade left the room.
So John McFarlane is a murderer,
said Watson sadly.
I don't think so, Watson,
Holmes replied.
What? But Lestrade's proof, the thumbprint. How do you explain it, Holmes?
It's impossible to explain,
said Holmes.
And for a very good reason. There was no thumbprint on this wall when I was here yesterday.
Chapter 7. The Man on the Top Floor. Watson did not know what to think.
I don't understand this, Holmes,
he said at last.
I don't understand this at all. If the thumbprint wasn't here yesterday...
Holmes held up a hand to stop him.
There are two possibilities, Watson. The first is that John Macfarlane left his cell at Scotland Yard during the night, took the train to Norwood, and came to Deepdean Lodge to make a bloody thumbprint on the wall here. I do not think this is very probable, Watson. Do you?
Of course not, Holmes,
said Watson.
Then you and I and Inspector Lestrade have the same opinion. And it was not John Macfarlane who left this thumbprint.
But Lestrade said that it was Macfarlane's thumbprint,
said Watson excitedly.
Oh, I am sure that it is Macfarlane's thumbprint,
Holmes replied.
But I am also sure that it was not John Macfarlane who left it here. Come, Watson.
Dr. Watson followed his friend out into the garden.
What are we doing, Holmes?
He asked.
We're looking,
said Holmes.
We're looking very carefully.
Holmes stood in the garden and looked thoughtfully at the front of the house. Then he walked across the lawn and looked at the side of the house. Next, Watson followed him to the back of the house, and then to the other side, which looked onto the Sydenham Road. Here, Holmes stood for a long time, with a look of great interest on his face.
Good,
he said at last, and walked quickly back to the front door, which was still open. Watson followed him inside, and downstairs into the basement. Holmes looked very carefully in every room on that floor, then did the same on the ground floor. There was no furniture in many of the rooms, but Holmes looked thoughtfully at the walls and at the floor. He and Watson then went upstairs and visited all the bedrooms and the bathroom. After that, they climbed to the top floor of the house, where there were 3 bedrooms, all empty. Holmes began to laugh. He laughed and laughed. Watson looked at his friend, astonished.
Holmes, what is it?
He asked.
Are you not feeling well?
Holmes stopped laughing at once and turned to Watson.
I'm feeling very well, Watson,
he said with a strange smile.
Come, let us find Inspector Lestrade.
They went downstairs and found the inspector at his table. He was busy writing his report.
Are you writing your report already, Inspector?
asked Holmes.
Are you so sure that you have your murderer?
Lestrade stopped writing and put down his pen. He did not look pleased.
Mr. Holmes, I have shown you my proof. John Macfarlane's thumbprint proves that he killed Jonas Oldacre. I have my murderer. He is in his cell at Scotland Yard as we speak.
I think, Inspector,
said Holmes,
that you should speak to one more person before you finish writing your report.
Who is this person?
asked Lestrade.
And where can I find him?
How many policemen do you have here today, Inspector?
Lestrade was surprised, but he answered immediately.
Sergeant Judd and 2 others.
And are they all big, strong men with loud voices?
Lestrade looked at Watson. Watson looked at Lestrade. They were both baffled.
They are all tall, and I'm sure that they can shout very loudly if they need to,
the inspector replied.
But I don't understand.
Holmes held up a hand.
You will understand, Inspector. Now, could you please call your men?
It was obvious that Lestrade was not happy. But he left the room and went to look for Sergeant Judd and the others. 5 minutes later, Holmes and Watson found Lestrade in the hall with his men.
Sergeant Judd, you will find some hay in the timber yard. Could you please bring it into the house?
Asked Holmes. Judd looked at Lestrade, who nodded. He came back a few minutes later with a bag of hay.
This will help us to find our man,
said Holmes.
Now, Watson, do you have any matches in your pocket?
Watson nodded.
Then we are ready. Follow me, please.
The policeman followed Holmes and Watson as they climbed the stairs to the top of the house. When they arrived, Lestrade's face was very red.
What are you doing, Mr. Holmes?
He asked crossly.
I hope that this is not a joke.
You will not have to wait much longer, Inspector,
said Holmes with a smile.
Could you please ask one of your men to bring some water from the bathroom?
Water?
Lestrade replied.
Mr. Holmes, I really must...
Please, Inspector.
Lestrade thought for a long moment, but in the end sent one of his men to the bathroom for water. When he returned, Holmes opened a window and then asked Watson to light the hay with a match. The hay caught fire immediately, and suddenly there was smoke everywhere.
Now we will find our man, Lestrade,
said Holmes.
Could we all please shout, fire? 1, 2, 3...
Holmes, Watson, and the 4 policemen all shouted,
Fire!
in loud voices.
Again?
Said Holmes.
Fire! And again? Fire!
This time, the shout was so loud that Lestrade put his fingers in his ears. Just then, a very strange thing happened. A secret door in the wall opened suddenly, and a little man ran out.
Here's your man, Inspector,
said Holmes with a laugh.
Sergeant Judd, please put some water on the hay to put out our little fire. Thank you. Inspector, this is Mr. Jonas Oldacre, the Norwood builder. I think we will learn that he also has another name. Mr. Cornelius.
Watson and the policeman looked long and hard at the little man, who was standing in front of them and shaking. He had grey eyes and white hair, and was very ugly.
Well,
said Lestrade at last when the fire was out.
Do you have nothing to say, Mr. Jonas Oldacre?
Lestrade's face was red and angry. Oldacre looked very afraid, but he laughed excitedly.
It was a joke, Inspector,
he explained.
No more. I never wanted to make any trouble for anybody.
What?
Said Lestrade angrily.
You didn't want to make any trouble? And an innocent man is in the cells at Scotland Yard as we speak.
Just my little joke, Inspector,
the builder said again.
Take him away, Sergeant,
said Lestrade.
The man is dangerous.
Oldacre went downstairs with Judd and the other policeman. Lestrade turned to Holmes.
Well, Mr. Holmes, once again, I have to thank you. This time, I was wrong, and you were right. John McFarlane is an innocent man. It's obvious that there was no murder here.
That's right, Inspector.
Holmes smiled.
But I understand your mistake. Jonas Oldacre was very clever.
But Sherlock Holmes was cleverer,
said Watson.
Very good work, Holmes.
Thank you, Watson. Now let's see the secret room.
Watson and Lestrade followed Holmes into the room, which was about 2 meters long. It was impossible to see the door from the passage, but in the room they found some furniture, food and water, newspapers and books. Holmes picked up a newspaper.
This morning's newspaper,
he said.
I'm sure that Oldacre has enjoyed reading about Mr. McFarlane's arrest, and I suppose that Mrs. Lexington is the person who has brought him his newspapers and his food and drink.
I must speak to that woman again,
said Lestrade.
I always thought she had her secrets.
Perhaps she has a very big secret,
said Holmes.
Perhaps she is more to Mr. Oldacre than a housekeeper.
Lestrade looked thoughtful.
Of course,
he said at last.
That's why she was happy to tell lies for him. She will go to prison for this, Mr. Holmes.
Very good,
Holmes replied.
Norwood will be a better place without her.
I have just one more question for you, Mr. Holmes,
said Lestrade.
Why did Oldacre do this? Why did he want me to arrest John McFarlane?
Holmes gave the inspector a long look.
Many years ago, Inspector,
he explained,
Jonas Oldacre fell in love. He fell in love with John McFarlane's mother. They spent some time together, but Mrs. McFarlane saw that Oldacre was cruel and dangerous, and she sent him away. Later, she married John's father. On the day that they married, Oldacre sent her a photograph of herself with her face slashed. He was very angry, and he never forgot it.
I see,
said Lestrade.
So that's why you went to Blackheath.
I wanted to talk to John's parents,
Holmes explained.
I couldn't understand why Oldacre wanted to leave everything to John in his will.
I've been very stupid,
said Lestrade sadly.
Not at all,
said Watson kindly.
But Sherlock Holmes has been very clever.
Holmes himself said nothing. Chapter 8. A Free Man. 2 days later, on a fine summer morning, Holmes and Watson were sitting once again in their Baker Street rooms. Watson was reading the newspaper excitedly.
It's here, Holmes,
he cried.
The story of our Norwood builder. Listen to this. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard realised that Jonas Oldacre was still alive and found him on the top floor of his house, Deepdean Lodge at Norwood, where he was hiding in a secret room. But Lestrade realised nothing at all, Holmes. This is terrible. If you...
It's not important, Watson,
said Holmes quietly.
What is important is that Oldacre will go to prison and John McFarlane will not die for a crime that he didn't commit. Lestrade knows what really happened, after all.
I don't understand how you can be so calm about this,
said Watson crossly.
It was you who realised that the builder wasn't dead, not Lestrade. Lestrade was convinced that John McFarlane was a murderer.
Just then the door opened, and Mrs. Hudson came in.
A young man to see you, Mr. Holmes,
she said with a smile. John McFarlane walked into the room. He looked calm and very happy. Holmes and Watson stood up.
Mr. McFarlane,
said Holmes,
I'm very pleased to see you.
Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, what can I say?
McFarlane replied.
Thank you so much for everything. You have saved my life. The police were convinced that I killed Jonas Oldacre.
Watson asked the young man to sit down, and Mrs. Hudson left them. Holmes lit a cigarette from the box on the table.
I was sure that I would die.
McFarlane went on.
I was at Deepdean House. I had a very good motive. And when the police found my thumbprint on the wall... Please tell me, Mr. Holmes, how you proved to Inspector Lestrade that I was innocent of this crime.
Holmes did not speak for a long moment. He looked very thoughtful.
It was a long time before I realised that there was no murder. But when I realised this, I understood everything. Oldacre once loved your mother and was very angry when she married another man. He had a lot of trouble with his business last year and lost a lot of money. His plan was to disappear, with Mrs. Lexington perhaps, and start a new life with a different name, Mr. Cornelius. He wanted everyone to think that he was dead because he didn't want anyone to look for him. And he wanted to hurt your mother and father. He wanted you to die for a crime that never happened.
But the burnt remains in the timber yard, what were they?
McFarlane wanted to know.
A dead dog, I think,
Holmes replied.
Not a dead builder.
What an evil man,
cried McFarlane.
My mother was right to say no when he asked her to marry him.
Oh, yes,
Holmes agreed.
Jonas Oldacre is a very bad man, and I hope that he will go to prison for a very long time.
I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes,
said McFarlane.
I am so pleased that I came to you in my trouble.
Holmes put out his cigarette and turned to Watson.
Are we free this morning, Watson?
He asked.
Yes,
his friend replied in surprise.
Why do you ask?
It's a beautiful morning,
said Holmes.
Let's go out.
Watson and McFarlane followed Holmes down the stairs and out into Baker Street. The sun was shining, and the streets of London were warm.
A beautiful morning.
Holmes said once again.
Watson, please find us a cab.
10 minutes later, the three men were in a cab and travelling south towards Scotland Yard.
Why are we going to Scotland Yard, Holmes?
Asked Watson.
I'm sure that our good friend, Inspector Lestrade, has something to say to Mr. MacFarlane,
Holmes replied. At Scotland Yard, they found Lestrade in his office. He looked surprised to see them.
I was just finishing my report,
he explained.
I thought that you might have something to say to Mr. MacFarlane, Inspector,
said Holmes, as the young man followed the detective and Dr. Watson into Lestrade's office.
Oh, of course,
Lestrade agreed. He didn't look very happy.
Mr. MacFarlane, I am very sorry that I thought that you were a murderer. I was wrong, of course, and Mr. Holmes was right. I hope that the time you spent here at Scotland Yard wasn't too unpleasant.
It wasn't the happiest time of my life,
MacFarlane replied.
but the important thing is that I am now a free man, thanks to Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
Yes, Mr. Holmes has been very helpful, once again,
said Lestrade.
We work very well together, Mr. Holmes and I.
Holmes smiled. Watson looked angry, but said nothing.
Mr. Holmes, as you're here,
the inspector went on,
and I'm writing my report, I have one more question for you. Why was Mr. MacFarlane's thumbprint on the wall?
Oldacre put it there.
Holmes explained.
When he and Mr. MacFarlane were working on his papers, he asked Mr. MacFarlane to seal a letter with wax. He then had John's thumbprint in the wax, and he put this on the wall with some of his own blood.
Very clever,
said Lestrade.
Yes,
Holmes agreed.
His only problem was that I knew that the thumbprint wasn't there the day before. As Mr. MacFarlane was in a cell here at Scotland Yard, he didn't put it there, so I asked myself who did. The answer to the mystery was obvious. Oldacre, of course. And how is the Norwood builder?
He's not a happy man,
said Lestrade, smiling at last.
It was all a joke, he says. And of course he didn't want to hurt Mr. MacFarlane here.
A strange joke,
said Dr. Watson.
Yes,
Holmes agreed.
It's a very strange joke that sends a man to his death.
I have to thank you, Mr. Holmes,
said Lestrade,
for saving the life of an innocent man.
Holmes smiled.
That is my business, Inspector. To save innocent people and make sure that those who are guilty go to prison. As long as I can do that, I will be a happy man.